They were supposed to be the greatest rock band of their generation. For a moment, they were. Then Jim Morrison decided he didn't want to be. The Doors formed in Los Angeles in 1965 when Ray Manzarek and Jim Morrison ran into each other on Venice Beach. According to Ray Manzarek's own memoir, Morrison recited a few lines of poetry on the sand that day, and Manzarek immediately said, "Let's start a band." That was the beginning. Within 2 years, they had a #1 hit, a sold-out tour, and a frontman the entire world couldn't stop watching. Jim Morrison was magnetic. 6 feet tall, leather pants, a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere underground. Rolling Stone called him one of the most charismatic performers in rock history. Audiences didn't just watch Morrison. They were pulled toward him, almost against their will. But here's what the posters and the mythology don't tell you. Jim Morrison was already drinking heavily by 1967, the same year Light My Fire hit #1. According to John Densmore, the band's drummer, in his book Riders on the Storm, Morrison would show up to rehearsals with a bottle. Not after rehearsal. Before. During. The alcohol wasn't a phase. It wasn't stress. It was structural. Morrison had built his entire creative identity around obliteration. He idolized the French poet Arthur Rimbaud, who believed the artist must deliberately disorder his senses to reach truth. Morrison took that idea and weaponized it against himself. By 1968, the cracks were already showing. Robbie Krieger, the band's guitarist, later said in interviews that recording sessions were becoming increasingly unpredictable. Morrison would disappear for hours. He would arrive incoherent. He would nail a vocal in one take and then be completely unreachable the next day. Ray Manzarek, the band's keyboardist and arguably its musical backbone, kept the ship running through sheer discipline, compensating for Morrison's absences, covering his bass lines with his left hand on the keys, keeping the band functional while its frontman drifted. According to Manzarek, he loved Morrison like a brother. But even brothers have limits. Then came Miami. March 1st, 1969. The Dinner Key Auditorium. What happened that night would fracture everything the Doors had built. According to multiple witness accounts and court documents, Morrison arrived on stage noticeably drunk. The crowd was massive, restless, already overheated. What followed has been debated for over 50 years. Morrison allegedly exposed himself on stage and urged the crowd to riot. He was arrested days later and charged with lewd and lascivious behavior, indecent exposure, open profanity, and public drunkenness. Morrison himself always denied the exposure happened. Several people who were there that night said they never saw it either. Elektra Records, the band's label, was privately skeptical of the charges. It didn't matter. The damage was instant and total. According to the band's management records, more than 30 concert bookings were canceled within weeks of the Miami arrest. Radio stations across the country pulled Doors songs from rotation. Sponsors disappeared. Venues that had been fighting to book the Doors suddenly wouldn't return calls. At the exact moment the Doors should have been at the absolute peak of their commercial power, Jim Morrison had effectively made them untouchable. The band lost hundreds of thousands of dollars. More importantly, they lost momentum, the kind of cultural momentum that, once broken, almost never fully returns. Morrison went to trial in 1970. He was convicted of indecent exposure and profanity, though the more serious charges were dropped. He was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor and a $500 fine. The case was being appealed when Morrison left for Paris. But from 1969 onward, the legal cloud never lifted. Every interview, every appearance, every business decision was shadowed by a pending criminal conviction. Morrison was facing the real possibility of jail. According to journalist Jerry Hopkins, who co-wrote the biography No One Here Gets Out Alive, Morrison appeared genuinely rattled by the legal situation in private, even as he projected defiance in public. Meanwhile, the creative chemistry inside the band was fracturing along a second fault line entirely. Jim Morrison didn't want to be a rock star anymore. He wanted to be a poet. This wasn't a casual preference. It was a consuming obsession. Morrison self-published 2 books of poetry, The Lords and the New Creatures, in 1969. He began identifying primarily as a writer, not a musician. He gave interviews where he dismissed rock music as a limited form. According to Densmore, Morrison started arriving at band meetings with notebooks full of verse and very little interest in discussing chord progressions or touring schedules. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore were professional musicians who wanted to keep making records and building a legacy. These were two fundamentally incompatible visions living inside the same four-piece band, and the tension was daily, grinding, and exhausting. The 1970 album Morrison Hotel was a gritty attempt to strip things back to blues, back to rawness, away from the psychedelic grandeur of their earlier work. It was well received, but getting it made was brutal. According to Densmore's account, sessions would stall for days waiting for Morrison to appear. And then L.A. Woman began, what would turn out to be the band's final album and, by almost any measure, one of their finest. But even that almost didn't happen. Paul Rothchild, who had produced every Doors album from the beginning and who had a close working relationship with the band, listened to early session recordings for L.A. Woman and quit. He told the band that Morrison's vocal performances sounded like a man going through the motions, what Rothchild described, according to multiple accounts, as cocktail lounge singing. He walked out. The band, stunned, decided to produce the album themselves with engineer Bruce Botnick, recording in their own rehearsal space rather than a formal studio. And somehow, stripped of the formality, something real came through. Morrison's voice on tracks like Riders on the Storm and Love Her Madly carried a weight and a weariness that felt completely unforced, because it was. He was exhausted. He was done, and the microphone caught every bit of it. By late 1970, Morrison told his bandmates he was leaving for Paris. He framed it as a writing sabbatical. He said he needed to step away from the machinery of fame, from the Morrison mythology, from the leather pants and the screaming crowds, and just write. According to Manzarek, the remaining three members were uncertain but not shocked. Morrison had been leaving in slow motion for years. Paris just made it official. He arrived in March 1971 with Pamela Courson, his longtime companion and the great love of his complicated life. He was 27 years old. He was bearded, heavier than he had been at his peak, and by most accounts that survive, from neighbors, from friends who visited, from Pamela herself, he seemed genuinely calmer. He walked. He wrote. He went to films. He visited the graves of Balzac and Oscar Wilde. He drank. Still, that never stopped. But Paris seemed to offer him something Los Angeles never had: anonymity. On the night of July 2nd going into July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of his apartment on the Rue Beautreillis. He was 27 years old. Pamela Courson found him. She called a doctor, not the police, which itself has been the subject of decades of speculation. French law at the time did not require an autopsy when there was no apparent evidence of foul play. No autopsy was performed. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. No inquest was ever opened. The absence of an autopsy has fed speculation ever since. According to investigative journalist Sam Burnett, who worked at a Paris nightclub Morrison frequented, Morrison may have ingested heroin that night, possibly without knowing what it was, or possibly knowing exactly what it was. Burnett, in his book The End, Jim Morrison, claimed Morrison was found in the nightclub bathroom earlier that evening, and that what happened at the apartment was the final act of an overdose that had already begun. The official story has never been confirmed or refuted because the body was never examined. Pamela Courson, the only witness, died of a heroin overdose herself in 1974, 3 years after Morrison, and before she ever gave a formal account of that night to any authority. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore tried to continue. They released 2 albums without Morrison, Other Voices and Full Circle. Neither connected. How could they? The Doors without Morrison was like a sentence without a verb. By 1973, they had quietly dissolved. What is left is the music, the myth, and a set of questions that will never be answered. The Doors had 5 years. 5 years of genuine, world-altering creative output, and then a slow-motion collapse driven by addiction, legal catastrophe, and a frontman who seemed to believe that destruction was just another form of art. Jim Morrison was not killed by the music industry, or by fame, or by Miami. According to everyone who was close to him, Manzarek, Dinsmore, Krieger, Corson, and the journalists who documented those final years, Morrison made his choices deliberately, one after another, until there were no choices left to make. The truth is not that the doors were destroyed. The truth is that Jim Morrison simply refused to be saved.